Right, so we're continuing through our architecture development iteration, and we're now on phase D, which is the technology architecture. If you recall, in the previous phase, information systems architecture, we dealt with data and application pieces. We're now going to take a closer look at how we string together technology components to be able to, in effect, run and automate those aspects of my application landscape. Right, so in the technology space, there are actually three sub areas that you're going to deal with. Now, just to summarize previously, what we had was, if you recall, we produced an application logical model. And that was really, remember, we grouped together functional bits of the organization from a business perspective and data. Right, and we pieced those together and we used some techniques to come up with an application. Well, now, within the technology architecture space, we're going to need to look at, well, how do I run this application? All right. And then also, well, how do I develop it? All right. And similarly, how do I operate it or manage it? So those are the three areas that you'll address within the technology landscape. Now, it's important to remember here that when we refer to technology, it's sometimes a bit of a confusing word depending on which market segment you're in, because if you're in the defense segment, for example, they see gunpowder as technology. So in other words, how you'd break this down, you've got to bring into use different terms so that your stakeholders have a clear understanding of, well, what exactly does this person mean by gunpowder. So remember, as we're coming through the cycle, we still have the 5 phases: stakeholders, views and viewpoints. So in this particular case, as you're understanding your stakeholders, you're realizing that their view of technology is gunpowder. You need to make sure that you represent those views and those viewpoints back in a way that is understandable to them. The other phases are reference models, as is to-be gap analysis. Now, as we come to the technology space, this is one of the areas in which there's actually a lot of utility in this space. There's a lot of reusable assets within the space, and often we find that you don't have to reinvent the wheel within this area. As a matter of fact, TOGAF provides a technical reference model for you to leverage off. But there's a variety of reference models in the industry which will allow you to leverage off so you have an understanding of this technology space that sits at the bottom here. And remember, when I'm referring to reference models and those types of things in utility, recall in Module 1, which we spoke about that utility model, that little high-level framework, we spoke about the utility of architecture and the innovate, mix, and assemble bits that you need to focus on. So my constant referral to utility, that's the model that you need to have in the back of your mind. So this is the utility space. And this is a bit of a weird triumvirate that occurs here, because basically your first view is, well, how do I run this application? And by run it, we mean, well, what is the networks that it has to run on? What are the databases? Is it going over the internet? Or is it a PABX system? For example, that's a telephone system, or an automatic calling answering system, and an IVR, or all the types of buzzwords that sit within the technology industry. These are tools, for example, when you phone a call center, and there's a voice on the other side, and press the following button or speak into it what you're looking for. Those bits of technology are also fit under what we refer to as this run space, as well as Microsoft Access, Microsoft Office, Microsoft Word, some of those more generic types of applications that you would use. And then there are also some very specific business applications, like SAP, which might be used for logistics, or ERP. There might be a CRM, which is a customer relationship management solution. So all of those run on a piece of technology that is sitting in some server room somewhere, that's air conditioned and requires cabling and wiring and databases and CPUs and memory to actually execute. Now, that's often referred to as infrastructure. Right? And sometimes this space is referred to as infrastructure architecture. And what that's talking about is this little piece here, how I run that particular application. Similarly, I have to answer the question in the technology space, well, how am I going to develop that application? Right? So in other words, what infrastructure is required to develop it? Well, I'm going to need the following software development tools. I'm going to need the following test environment. I'm going to need all of these script running tools to be able to develop the application. And I'm going to need the following methods and techniques to be able to develop that application. And then on the other side of this, you have, well, how do I operate it? Right? In the operations space, there's lots of highly mature frameworks down there. Some of you might have heard of ITIL, which is the IT Infrastructure Library, that you can use there to help you identify, how am I going to operate that application? In other words, if it's got to be up 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, well then I need to be able to manage it. I need to look at events that are occurring. What happens if the network goes down or the internet goes down? I'll lose my router or something to that extent. What's going to happen? How am I going to get events that are elevated to me? How am I going to be able to phone the right people to fix it? Is there a help desk or a call desk that I can call? That's really the operate space. And these sort of 3 pillars of my technology architecture all help me identify how I use technology to keep that application up and running within the environment. Now, on the back of that, each of these pieces requires a reference model to work with. So in the run space, and similar to how we did within the application architecture, let's have a look here, and now we look at all of the run components. So we bring these application pieces together, right? And I list all of my applications here. So this might be, we had a customer management system in the previous example, right? We had a product management system in the previous example, and there might be all of the list of applications that came out of my application architecture space. They go down here. This piece here, oops, I'm just going to wipe this way, kind of sits at the top here. What are the technology building blocks to run that particular environment? And this is where we can go back and we can refer to the technology reference model. Remember the utility that I spoke about? You can go into a number of vendor environments and get, for example, an ERP technology reference model. And that reference model kind of sits at the top here, and it says, well, this is what I need to run that piece of technology. This is the type of presentation layer, in other words, the desktop that I need to run. Can it run on a tablet? Well, this is all the technology required for the tablet, right? So that's all sort of the presentation pieces that sit over here. Well, what network do I need to run it on? Well, it's going to run on the following network infrastructure, all of those pieces. And then what are the back-end pieces that sit? Well, it's going to run on the following databases, all of those components of the technology reference model. And really all you do now as you go through this exercise is you look at each application and you say, well, I need that bit of front-end presentation layer, I need this bit of network, and I need that bit of database infrastructure. And you're working through a cycle in which you're looking to build up a technology architecture by how we overlay all of the applications and how they use the technology building blocks that sit within the particular reference model. And sort of falling out the bottom of that then is a technology architecture specification document, looking at, well, which of these pieces am I going to use to be able to address all of these applications for the runtime environment. And that makes up the primary deliverable for this particular phase. Similarly, from an operate and a develop perspective, you go through the exact same exercise. You take all of the applications which sit down here. So here are all my applications, similar to the model I explained here. And you would go and get something like an ITIL model, which is the IT infrastructure library. You would look at a model that helps you operate an environment. And you could introduce that model sitting up here. And now you can go and say, well, for these applications, what pieces of that model do I require to operate it correctly? And similarly, you can do the same from a development perspective. All of that rolls up together, and coming out of that would be your technology architecture specification document, which is the primary deliverable coming out of this particular phase. Sitting in there are things like the technology architecture reference model, which is one of the examples that you can refer to. And like all other artifacts that we've shown you, you can overlay different colors on it and overlay to be and current state and maturity of those components and hotspots and issues. You can overlay all of those pieces on that model. And it's a very nice document to communicate those things back up to business people. And that kind of wraps up the technology phase and really sort of ends the phases that have the repeatable 5 processes and that you would need to do across your development cycle, your architecture development iteration. And so just to summarize that, the repeatable cycle is views and viewpoints, reference models, as is 2B gap analysis. And this is the last phase in which you'll use those 5 steps to develop your architectural outputs. So on the back of the business architecture, information systems architecture, and technology architecture, perhaps drop down into the discussion forum and have a discussion with your peers around, well, how do we actually leverage these techniques within our current business environment? And specifically this technology area, which tends to be some of the more mature spaces, perhaps you can kind of have a discussion around, well, are these really relevant in today's society? Well, what about cloud? There's all this cloud technology. Do we need to do architecture to this level of granularity if we're going to just push it all out to the cloud anyway? So what do you think? and have that discussion with your peers. And also similarly, our next module will now be taking the gap analysis that came out of this architecture development iteration from business, data, application, technology, and we're beginning to look at how do we actually look for opportunities and solutions? Where are the solution building blocks that we can plug in to solve some of the issues that we've identified up at this architectural level?